Let's see here. So it's recording, right? We're good. Okay, we're recording. We're record. Okay. Hello. I actually am realizing right now that I don't have to take this like so seriously. Um, but welcome. Thank you for watching this. If you're seeing this, you're at least a $10 a month contributing patron to the Eureka Compass vegan community here on Patreon. As promised and stated, we're doing cooking videos and some instructional classes here on vegan cooking. This one is starting with some bread work. Bread is peasant food. It's one of our oldest foods. It's one of the first forays by humanity into the chemistry of cooking. It was where we started harnessing yeast. There's a lot that goes on into bread that if you want to, you can make it really, really complicated. But at its core, bread is really 4 ingredients. It's flour, salt, water, and yeast. Everything that you do after that complicates it or enhances flavor or does certain things such as enhancing leavening times, the activity of the yeast. So what we're doing here to get everybody a little comfortable with working with bread is making hamburger buns. I'm doing an event tonight at Cadence Records and Coffee. This will have already happened by the time you're watching this video. But I'm making little slider buns. So we're going to take this opportunity to feed 2 birds with 1 scone and film this video and get my dough made for the event tonight. This recipe is a non-vegan recipe that I found that I then veganized. When you're looking for vegan recipes for certain dishes, an easy thing to do is find the non-vegan one, talk to a more experienced vegan baker or get online, whatever, and find vegan substitutes for some of the ingredients that might not be vegan. So a lot of hamburger buns, especially homemade ones, look to add egg to it. There is a chemistry to eggs, and most of what that's doing is offering a little greater viscosity to the liquid, which as the dough rises is going to make the crumb just a little heartier. So here we're making hamburger buns, and when crumb there, bread has 2 parts, the crust and the crumb. The crumb is anything that's inside the crust. So these hamburger buns, we want to have an airy but not very cavernous air pockets in it. You do want it to not be like a sourdough or something where you're all of a sudden going to get those big air pockets. So in substituting egg in this recipe, I'm using flaxseed. I have in my grinder here 3 tablespoons. I take that back. I have 6 tablespoons. I'm making a big batch here. You probably don't want to make this much unless this is for like a graduation party or something. We'll have the recipe listed in the description of this video. So I have my flaxseed. Now when working with flaxseed, and I do that a lot here at Eureka Compass, you want to work only with whole flaxseed and grind it fresh. The oils in flaxseed are incredibly volatile, and although it's not necessarily going to go bad, the flavor of it will change. So if you buy a bag of ground flaxseed, keep it refrigerated as soon as you open it. use it as quickly as you can, or invest in a coffee spice grinder that you only use for non-coffee things, or I have a Vitamix blender. They're certainly worth the investment, but any KitchenAid or standard blender will work. You just want to make sure that there's enough volume in there. So that 6 tablespoons of flaxseed is not enough volume. Now this recipe requires sugar. One of the little tricks for baking with sugar is to grind the sugar down. So I'm working with some organic, wholesome brand cane sugar. We are putting a cup of that in there with the flaxseed. And now when you're grinding stuff, don't start it all the way full bore, ponies on the run. Okay, you want to begin moving it around. I'm going to turn this on. It's going to get loud, so I'm going to finish talking here. This will probably grind for a bit, so I imagine some of this is going to be edited down with the magic of audio-video technology. I'm just talking to be funny right now. So we're going to grind it down. We're going to start it. I have this set at 3 right now. At 3, it's beginning to mix the sugar and the flaxseed around. And now we're going to slowly bring it up. We shut it down. Agitate it around. You're really not going to want any unground flaxseed in there. This grind to the sugar is what is often referred to as a baker's grind. You can buy baker's ground sugar, not always available everywhere. You can certainly find it online. Or if you really want to take that extra step and personalize a recipe for yourself, you can just create your own baker's grind by grinding it. What baker's grind is it's not powdered. Powdered is actually created by a crushing of the sugar. This is just reducing the crystal a little bit, but it will still have some of the crystalline structure to it. So we just shook the blender up a bit, and we're going to start again starting slightly lower. And whatever you do with the blender, you don't want to agitate the canister while it is on the base. It will destroy your base, and then you're left with something that you either need to fix, or you just feel bad that you're like throwing out a bunch of plastic and wire. We're going to give this one more grind here. Now what we're going to do is we are just going to scrape this down, see how that all looks. All right. So that's the ground sugar, ground flaxseed there. And now what I have here is the yeast. So there's a few different ways of adding yeast to bread. Oftentimes you basically create a water starter. There's the sourdoughs where you create a minimal liquid water starter. There's some where you add the yeast to the dry ingredients and then all the wet goes in. These hamburger buns aren't going to have a lot of time where we're proofing them. We want a very active rise, and we want most of the active rise to happen in the oven. This again is the chemistry of cooking. With yeast, there's three important factors. Yeast eats sugar, so it's what's the available sugar for the yeast to feed off of. There's the temperature. So if you put something in the fridge, it will still be active, but it'll be active at a much, much slower rate. And then there is time. So here we are going to use shorter time, more sugar, higher heat content, and as soon as it goes into the oven, we're really going to get a big rise out of these buns. So not a lot of proofing time. So these are something, this is a recipe that you can make the day of if you want fresh hamburger buns or even just a good dinner roll for a standard sandwich or whatever that evening. So with baking, the really important to get everything that's in there. This isn't like making a marinade or a soup stock where if some of the onions or whatever don't go in, it's just fine. You'll still get the flavor. Bread is not always very forgiving. So B-roll.
Have some coffee.
Right. Just all right. I need something a little bit more extreme here, real quick. We should get a stock photo of a dog where they still have the like photographer's watermark on it. Oh, look, there's a dog over there.
Whenever we get bored, we'll put up dog videos.
So what I have here is the yeast, sugar, and the flaxseed. And I'm grinding or just mixing all that up in my container here. Because then I am going to add lukewarm water to this. And let's see here. So, again, I'm making a much larger batch than you'll probably make at home. So we'll have the recipe listed in the comments here. And so this is going to get pretty active pretty fast. And when working with yeast and water, you really don't want anything below 90 degrees or above 110 degrees. This, I'm just feeling it. I know it's the temperature that I want. But if you have a kitchen thermometer at home, definitely test it, but get a feel for it. And before you know it, you'll be like, who needs thermometers? I'm a pro. Okay, so we are going to let that sugar, yeast, and water starter now begin to get active. It'll bubble up. It'll look really cool. Talk about yeast real quick. There are definitely very different types of yeast and quality in yeast. I don't like using fast rise. There's really no reason to do that. If you're working with the right temperature water, if you're working with good quality amount of time and prepping everything, there's really no reason to use fast rise. I use the Red Star Active dry yeast here at the shop. Fleischmann's is a good one. I carry the Red Star. Red Star, with what I'm doing and my techniques, I found to be the most foolproof in the kitchen here. But if you have a particular yeast brand that you like, that's fine. But if you find certain recipes aren't working out, definitely check to see if the yeast has expired. That yeast packet that's just been sitting in the back of your cupboard, it may not be something that you want to use because the yeast will go dormant and it won't be as effective. Here we go. So, coming up next, we are going to create our dry ingredient mix over here. This is going to be a lot of flour for what I'm doing here. When you're measuring a lot of things out, one of the first techniques that I learned was getting a larger container where I could just scoop flour out. And I know that right here on this container is 14 cups of flour. So now instead of just 14 cups of flour, I can grab the scoop, it's up there, that's 14 cups of flour. Now, if you're going to be doing a lot of flour or bread baking, I definitely recommend getting a 4-cup dry container, possibly even one larger. If you're looking at a lot of European recipes, most of that's by weight. So that's actually a pretty quick way to do things as well. So getting kitchen scales, those are relatively inexpensive and a lot of them are very affordable these days. The flour that I work with Bakersfield Flour and Bread. They're in Northeast Minneapolis. They are a craft milled, beyond organic miller. They work with some really incredible producers here in western Minnesota, the Dakotas. They're growing, not necessarily all of it are heritage grains, but some older variety wheats. This is their bread flour. Now, there's a difference when you're looking at flours. An all-purpose or a cake and pastry flour is going to be a lower gluten content. For bread, you want a higher protein, higher gluten content. That's what gives everything its elasticity and allows it to rise up and expand and not break and the air from the yeast to escape. So muffins, cakes, scones, something where you want a very dense crumb, all-purpose or a cake and pastry flour. When working with bread, go for a dedicated bread flour, and I definitely recommend you get Bakersfield. If you're in a pinch and you just have an all-purpose or a cake and pastry flour, you can always add a small amount of straight-up wheat gluten to it to just get that protein back in there. Now, since I'm making a lot, I still need to add 7 cups of flour to this. So. If you'll notice, to keep better track of how many I've put in there, I've moved them around. So I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right. Now, next up, we have a tablespoon of salt. I cannot endorse enough having just kitchen gloves in your house. hand mixing everything is way better than using a spoon. Just really get your hands in there, really make sure you've moved everything around. And you can see how quickly, see, this is not a fast rise yeast, but that combination of sugar and everything has gone viral in there really fast. So, there's that. And we're just gonna, you'll see there is some still dry yeast on top of that. So we're just going to knock that back in there. And now with this, I haven't put all of the water that's going to go into this recipe into here. So when I pour this out, create a little opening in there. When I pour this out, I will be adding more water and measuring the oil in this container as well. That will really help rinse out any of the sugar and yeast that's left in the container. So that is something that you can do. This isn't to have the yeast and water and sugar fully mixed all alone. This was really just to activate the sugar or activate the yeast. So you just need a little bit in there. And again, mix up more of that dry yeast that's in there. This is getting quite a bit of oil. There we go. Oh, okay. You'll notice that some recipes for bread have you oil the bowl that you put the dough into. Some of them have you add the oil. Some of them have you brush the loaf with oil before you bake it, or just add oil. All of them are right, depending on the recipe. Adding oil in this stage makes for a moister, slightly richer crumb and a little bit more golden crust when it bakes. So if you're out there just kind of experimenting with your own bread recipes, depending on what you're going for, when, where, and how much oil you add will affect that. I could put this into the big Hobart mixer, but I'm not going to. If you have a small KitchenAid mixer at home, that's great. But right now, with this recipe, I really am just going to get it mixed up. And I've got a large enough bowl here that when the time comes to really knead it, I will be able to do it just in the bowl. But to avoid messes, years of working in kitchens, I have learned to work with intention and relatively controlled over rushed and fast and hurried, because if you're going to knock some of the flour out, or all of a sudden you dump a bunch of the moisture out, that will really affect the recipe. So here it's starting to come together. Now when you're kneading by hand, you can definitely feel the lumps that are in there. So what the kneading is going to do is really start activating the gluten that is in the flour and creating a smoother, more elastic dough. Now, as far as some bread recipes go, this is on the moister side of doughs. Some will appear very dry. Some will be closer to a batter. This one is just a little sticky. And again, as you're working the dough, the flour will absorb more and more of the moisture, and it will actually get less sticky. Now, this is something that if you were working with a smaller amount of dough, you could roll out onto a floured surface and knead it that way and really roll it out. Or you can work in a large bowl. And this is already getting less sticky, which is really good. I'm not going to lie, it's been a long time since I've hand kneaded dough. When you have a big Hobart mixer, you let the machine do the work as much as possible. And really scraping down everything on the sides there. At this stage in it, this is going to get hand formed into the buns. So it's not super important that it gets really, really, really worked, because you're basically going to separate these into smaller balls and get a whole nother opportunity to agitate them. Nice and sticky. And let's just, but getting less and less sticky, which is a good sign. All right. So, at this point, I've got that dough well worked, well mixed, and we right now are going to cover it just with a little plastic wrap. A smaller amount, you could use the moist towel. You just don't want it to dry out. And we are going to let it sit for about 15 minutes. Whew. And we're back.
Oh, wait, I do that.
So we let this rise about 15 minutes. The dough is much less sticky than it was before. So I am giving it a real solid kneading now. We're going to push some of the air out of it. Oh, that is good. A smooth, elastic dough where you can see I haven't added any flour to the bowl and it's not sticking. It's not sticking to the gloves anymore. I'm getting quite a bit of resistance. You know, when you push that down, it's bouncing back. That is some really well activated gluten. This doubled in size during that rise. Other aspects when you're working with a bread recipe. If we really wanted to, I could cover this again and let it proof another hour, and then knock it down, and at that point form it. And you're going to get the yeast working that way is going to change the flavor a little bit. You're going to get a little deeper depth of flavor to it. I'm not looking for a big fancy roll here. Just looking for a nice standard, flavorful hamburger or sandwich bun. So we've got that. We've moved it down. Some nice it's a nice smooth elastic dough, and just going to form this into a little ball here. Okay. That was not a whole lot of kneading. And again, as I had said, there was that initial mixing. We let it rise, kneaded it pretty well there again. And now we're going to get an opportunity to really knead each individual roll. All right. So I'm going to demonstrate now. As you're forming these, you need to understand that this is going to almost double in size once it goes into the oven. So I'm just kind of forming it into a ball, putting the again, really working it. And I don't want it perfectly round, I want it a little bit more saucer shaped. So there in the palm of my hand, that's going to be the size that you want for your standard hamburger bun, because that is going to double in size. I'm going to be putting these for sliders tonight, so I'm going to take these down. This is also a fun coming into entertaining season, holiday seasons, things like that. Any sort of work events, the big team dinner on Friday night, whatever it might be that you're doing, wherever it is that you are at. Or if you have kids and a big hamburger bun isn't always work perfectly for them, that's the size that I'm doing for the slider. So again, we have, here we go. Let me grab my oil the pan. And again, when you have each individual one there, this is a good way to get a nice smooth top to it. And start adding these to the tray here. Now, these are going to get another proof. Once they're all on the tray, we're going to want to let them proof for about 10 minutes. So you do want to work fast because those ones that are already out and have been worked, by the time I get to the end of this, if I'm going slow, they're basically going to be ready to go into the oven. So I am doing a bit where I'm folding it under to create what will be the top, pinching it together at the bottom, and then I have a nice smooth ball like that, and then this is a good active yeast in there. It's actually starting to rise again. So this is another way to kind of get some of the old air out of the dough before it goes on the tray and goes into the oven. Again, a nice smooth top that'll be really attractive for your little finger sandwiches there. I also want to point out that uniformity is not always perfect. Because especially when you're entertaining, there might be that person who sees the one big one and they really want it. There might be that person who sees the slightly smaller one and is like, oh, that's the perfect size that I want for the sandwich that I'm going to make. So if you're sitting here and doing this stuff at home and some armchair Andrew Zimmerman, whatever that guy's name is like, oh, you didn't get them all the same size. You've really just created choices and options for folks who maybe want something more suited to their appetite. So don't make food for people to eat, not for Instagram. I'm going to get 12 on this tray and then put these in the oven once I get the other tray started, because you do want them to rise a little bit. but they will really blow up in the oven. My oven is a little over 380 degrees right now. Oven temps are not uniform. Ovens don't all cook the same. If I had one recommendation of a great at-home cooking tool, it's a 45-year-old stone-lined pizza oven. If you don't have room for that, I recommend getting a pizza stone and keeping it in the oven. Once you heat your oven up, as you're opening and closing it, that warmed pizza stone will actually help to bring the oven back up to temperature much faster. I think that you could start at 350 degrees the first time that you bake these. I wouldn't set something any higher than 385. I always turn the anything that I'm baking roughly halfway through the baking time to make sure that there's an even browning to everything. No matter how new or how old or how fancy the oven, there will be hot spots and inconsistencies to how the air flows through the whole oven. But I trust you to know your oven the best. The most important thing with these buns is you don't want to be too hot. They will burn on the outside before they've fully risen, and you don't want that to happen, or the outside will cook before the inside has fully risen and you'll get cracks on the top. So I would suggest starting at 350. If you found that your oven kind of is not that hot, you could be comfortable at 375, but I wouldn't go over 385. My oven at home, I pretty much always set for 385 when working with any sort of breads. So, there's those. I'm going to set these aside, let them proof just a little bit, probably another 5 minutes right now, probably in the time that it'll take me to get another tray set up, then those will go into the oven. But you don't want them to overproof right now, so don't let them sit longer than 10 minutes. They won't rise as well in the oven. With these, we want most of the rise to happen in the oven. In the oven, I set a timer for 6 minutes. I'm not sure that that's going to take just 6 minutes, but at 6 minutes, I will spin it and reassess it. So. So I just added another tray. That was 6 minutes. I looked at those. They're coming along, but easily another 6 minutes, so just started the timer again. Scotty. Look, there's a dog. Oh, yeah. Beautiful rolls. So that was a little longer than 12 minutes. These next trays I'm going to be pulling out exactly at 12 minutes. But once those rest, those are going to be perfect. Definitely all bread, you want it to fully cool before you're trying to cut into it. You're just going to destroy the crumb on the inside. So we're going to let those cool, and then we're going to put them in a little fancy bowl with a little checkered thing, and stylize it for a nice little photo. And I'm going to go over to the counter and sit down with like a Topo Chico and look like I have this whole glamorous life eating slider sandwiches that I made the rolls myself. There you go. From my oven to your home. Oh, yeah. Look at that. Look at that beautiful crumb. And I'm over caffeinated and I'm jittery.